Shalom and welcome to the Talking Memory International Lecture Series. My name is Medin Shachar and I am an educator and a guide at the Ghetto Fighters House and will be your host for today's event, book club event, Rescue and Remembrance, Imagining the German Collective After Nazism. I want to welcome our global audience with a special welcome as always to the survivors and their families that are with us today. We want to thank everyone for their support and interest in our programs. Today's program is in partnership with Gesicht Zeichen, the Rebbe Chair Forum at George Washington University, Classrooms Without Borders, and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Study Center. In our recent Talking Memory programs, we explored Landsberg not only as a site of persecution, but as a place where survivors began the difficult work of rebuilding their lives and shaping the first forms of Holocaust remembrance within the DP camp. We saw how survivors themselves became active agents of memory, documenting their experiences, commemorating their dead, and asserting their presence in a landscape still marked by violence. At the same time, remembrance was not shaped by survivors alone. In the years that followed, Germans too began slowly and unevenly to confront the history in their midst. Efforts to commemorate were often marked by tension, silence, and gradual acknowledgement, reflecting the complex and ongoing process of facing a difficult past. This evening, or today, this afternoon, this morning, as we turn to Kobi Kabalek's book, Rescue and Remembrance, Imagining the German Collective After Nazism, we are invited to consider these intertwined histories, how survivors remembered and commemorated their experiences, and how those memories existed alongside and sometimes in dialogue with German attempts to reckon with the legacy of persecution and rescue. Our program today will unfold as a dialogue. We will begin with Dr. Kobi Kabalek, who will introduce his book and share the central questions that guide his research. Following his remarks, Harry Legg will offer comments on the book, reflecting on its contribution to our understanding of the attitudes and actions of the non-Jewish German population during the Nazi period and its place within current scholarship. We will then move into a conversation between Dr. Kabalek and Harry Legg, expanding on these themes and exploring the ongoing challenges of remembrance, commemoration, and confronting the past. This dialogic format reflects the spirit of the Talking Memory series, which seeks not only to present research, but to open space for thoughtful exchange and shared reflection. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kobi Kabalek. Kobi Kabalek received his PhD from the University of Virginia and is Assistant Professor of Holocaust Studies and Visual Studies at Penn State University since 2019. His research focuses on historical perceptions, moral sentiments, emotions, and memory in various media in Germany, Israeli, and transnational Holocaust history. He explores marginalized phenomena in Holocaust testimonies, historical writing, and popular culture, with special attention to the role of emotions, imagination, and horror in our understanding and representation of the Holocaust. And with that, Kobi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maiden. Thanks so much for the invitation to come and to take part in this event. And thanks so much for all of you for coming. Wow. Takes a while to just even consume the numbers. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to try to give a few comments about what the book is trying to do. I find that with time it's very difficult to really reduce it to just one thing, because it feels that after a while writing about all kinds of topics, you just have a lot to say and you want to say all of it. So I think the book is trying to go in different directions, but I will try to reduce it now to the main points. So in one sentence, the book asks how people in Germany, both Jews and non-Jews, from the Nazi years to about 2022, we're not really covering the last couple of years, described and commemorated those who helped Jews during the Holocaust. And the book is also trying to do something else in addition, and that is to reflect about the very fact it is being done. And this is what I'll try to explain in the next few minutes. Since the 1980s, historians and social scientists have been inquiring what led some people to help persecuted Jews during the Holocaust, despite the risks and against a broad tendency to concentrate on one's own fate and needs. The scholars found that the helpers were driven by diverse motivations from personal gain, ideological, political, or religious convictions, as well as situational factors such as physical proximity, organization, sometimes just chance, or shared social circles. They therefore concluded that assistance to Jews cannot be reduced to moral views. It is not a good person who does the good action or the good act, because some of the helpers held anti-Semitic outlooks. Some of them collaborated with the Nazis on other events, and others have initially saved Jews and later handed them over to the genocidal authorities. And against this great complexity of trying to understand the difficulty of reducing why people helped in certain situations, we see post-war depictions that focus much more on morality and on memory and on making certain people into complete good or bad, to either perpetrators or victims or helpers, rescuers. So in the last 20 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, 25 years by now, we see on the background of this, we see a great attention to rescue of Jews during the Holocaust, but especially in political and public spheres. We see all kinds of publications, historical studies, and statements from Poland to Morocco to Japan to wherever you want to go, who seek to determine that helping Jews characterized much or most or all of a specific population or country. And in doing so, they basically try to prove the morality of a certain national collective. We know maybe the example of the Polish president Andrzej Duda, who stated in 2018 that the thousands of Polish rescuers that Yad Vashem honored are proof for that the Polish nation in its majority helped the Jews during the war. And yet, although the Polish rescuers are the biggest group of rescuers commemorated, for example, in Yad Vashem, they were actually less than 0.5% of the population at the time. And still Duda, the Polish president, uses them in order to project a certain favorable image of the collective. And so we see this phenomenon in quite a lot of countries in the last 20, 25 years or so. And there are more and more studies that speak about this. But then I realized that when I look at Germany, the image is quite different. Rather than focusing much more on presenting the nation in positive words in relation to celebrating the rescuers, there is much more a tendency to emphasize that the Germans were all bad. We see a lot of scholars and public speeches and so on and activities that emphasize that German helpers were a tiny minority and that their very existence refutes the apologetic claims of many Germans after the war that one could not do anything against the Nazi terror. So they are being used basically by stressing the small numbers and the fact that they are so exceptional in order to say something about the German population as a whole. Or in other words, by stressing that rescuers were a small minority, such statements project an image of a certain desired or undesired image of Germany, in which the rarity of rescuers casts a dark shadow on the majority population, as if people could either be pro-Jews or anti-Jews, as if everything connected to their behavior was so black and white. So rather than regarding rescuers or the existence of rescuers, no matter how small, and they are always a small number, if we look in comparative studies on genocide, there are always very small number of people who are on the side of the perpetrators and a very small number of people who are on the side of the rescuers, and the great majority is usually in between. We see, therefore, after in the last 20, 30 years or so, an emphasis much more on their rarity. So in the face of the complicated and shifting historical realities, people who can sometimes help Jews, but on other occasions could actually persecute other Jews or support the persecution of others, whether this was in Germany or in the in Nazi-occupied territories. There are attempts to go basically to correct or to deal with this complicated image that does not really allow us to speak clearly about good and bad by exactly projecting these simplistic images in which the exception, so to speak, proves the rule. Yes. And so one of the main arguments in relation to the rescue of Jews is that it has been a complete minority. And the second one is that after the war, no one really wanted to speak about these rescuers in both East and West Germany. And only with Schindler's List, which came out in 1993 internationally and appeared in Germany in 1994 as a kind of a state ritual almost, with participation of the German president at the time, Richard von Weizsäcker. We find much more an attempt to create growing attention to the memory of the Holocaust that is accompanied by more attention to this new narrative that is brought from America. And very often there is really this notion that the whole discussion of the rescue of Jews really started with Schindler's List. And what I want to do, or wanted to do in the book, is to show that the very arguments for the non-existence of any references after the war to these rescuers are themselves a part of a certain tendency or a way of understanding the world, and are based on this assumption that the exception gives us some kind of access to general reality. Since we don't know what the majority we never know what the majority is. We don't have the means of measuring that, and the majority changes, right? People change, they don't act in the same way all the time, and therefore there is a need to create some kind of simplicity, and people are going towards these depictions of entire nations as being either this or that. So what I try to show in the book, in the different chapter, is basically several things. The first one is to look at the Nazi years themselves and to try to show what rescue or help to the persecuted actually meant, starting in 1933 and going all the way to the end of the war, seeing how there were different acts that could be considered as solidarity or assistance towards Jews, and also how they were very much unclear for so on the one hand, they were clear as immoral acts. The Nazis marked them as the worst thing you could do is stand by Jews. The creation of community, of a moral behavior, is based on the assumption that you remove the Jews from the community. You are not being, so to speak, friendly towards Jews. And basically the Nazis were trying to push the population to act in certain ways and to act negatively towards Jews and not positively, and the different stages through which this happens. But also what I'm trying to show in that chapter, first of all, is the complexity, how sometimes you have an SA man who helps this Jewish family on a certain day, even though on the week later he probably participated in actions against Jews, or other cases in which people encountered very complex responses of the German population, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, and so on. And how the Nazis are trying to basically get rid of these kind of responses while acting as if there is no problem at all, while saying that the German population as a whole is morally committed to the Nazi ideal. They at the same time are trying to criticize the German populations for what it's doing. And so the first chapter really shows how there is this kind of an element of looking at rescuers or helpers as a kind of a way to judge morality, and how what happens in the post-war years from 1945 basically all the way to 2000 yesterday focuses much more on how on the same basic idea that through the attitudes toward Jews, one can discover or decide or judge morality not only on an individual level but also on a collective level. So it's two things that become completely reduced to these kind of judgments. And in a way, a part of the critique that the book is trying to make is that the very concept that we're using, the very patterns through which we are trying to measure this reality, are patterns that the Nazis themselves have used. It doesn't mean that the Nazis used them first, because a lot of these concepts were taken from other concepts previously, but at the same time, to understand that we are still, I would say that we are still stuck, or we are much more today stuck in a moral discussion, in a moral discourse that has really begun or has become evident, especially during the Nazi years. And then what my next chapters do, the second, third, fourth, and fifth, proceed more or less chronologically, but also go a little bit back and forth in relation to the topics. And the first one, chapter 2, in this case, the first one after the war, deals with all kinds of what I call scattered memories, or cases in which the topic appears only on very isolated moments. And I brought here a few examples to show you how this looks like. Okay. So this is just a quote from, I mean, this begins already in the middle post-war years. People speak constantly about either they have helped, or they ask others to say about them that they have helped, or they depict themselves in some way or another, in one way or another, morally, by referring to this notion in autobiographies, published diaries, and also in denazification procedures, which is what we see here. A letter sent by one of the person who was, or his mother was persecuted as Jewish, and provides, these are the well-known Persil-Scheine, right, that provide some kind of validation that is moral. There are constant references to that in all occupation zones. There are references in films. These two are from West Germany. The one on the left is, these are really great films. The one on the left, the Devil's General from 1955, was before that a play in 1947 by Karl Zuckmayer, sorry. And the one on the right is a very powerful mini-series where the first episode really speaks much more directly about all kinds of attempts to help Jews, but all of these attempts, or many of them, actually fail. And we see this also in a lot of East German films from the period, either from immediately after the war, Marriage in the Shadows, the one on the left, or Stars from 1959. That received also a lot of international attention. They speak constantly about failed attempts to help Jews, and I'm trying to show there how, by speaking about these failures of these attempts, very often these depictions are trying to create some kind of a self-critical message, while referring to rescue, but not in the classic way that we would today. Or in these kind of East German depictions of the child of Buchenwald in the film Naked Among Wolves from 1963, the novel, very successful novel from 1958, where we could see here, I really love this poster because we could really see here the care through the hand, the care of the older man to the young boy who was somehow smuggled into the Buchenwald concentration camp and was hidden by inmates until the very last moment of liberation. And a general same kind of a narrative that is also depicted in the Buchenwald concentration camp memorial itself, in the centerpiece of the memorial, where we see again the image here on the left of a child. And I couldn't find the picture that I have of the statue from behind, where you really see the hand again, just like here on the back, this time on the back of the child. So this notion of rescue becomes very central also in the central political places of East Germany, of the East German dictatorship, and appears in quite a lot of memoirs and different kinds of autobiographical writing of people who were persecuted as Jews. This is more for Harry's topic because these are really a top example of a Christian Jewish family who are saved or helped by quite a lot of especially Christian helpers. Oops. And as you can see, openly speak several times in this book against this notion of a collective condemnation of the Germans. So my point in these, and these are just a few of these examples, they are trying to show on the one hand that there are both Jews and non-Jews who are writing about these topics, that they are writing about them in different media, in different contexts, in films, but also in very personal trial proceedings or things like that. And throughout society, they are very often just mentioned sometimes as one sentence within entire books, but always in a way that if you read them across, you read all of these different elements, all of these different books and publications and memorials and speeches that include short references to the topic are nevertheless, you get the message of something that exists just in a different way than what we assume. And yeah, and then the next chapters, I'm not going to go too much, just to show a little bit more examples. In the late 50s and the early 60s, there are all kinds of special collections that create specific kind of titles for these people that speak about them for the first time within one framework, either trying to give them certain awards and honors, and in other cases trying to project a certain image of the German society, as we can see here in relation to the Eichmann trial, in a publication in the popular magazine the Stern. So here the attempt is much different than the ones that I spoke about at the beginning, right? Where the original idea is to try to speak about the entire German nation as being either good or the entire German nation as being mostly bad. The exception is this or that. Here the assumption is at least to show that there was some good. So it actually starts with a much darker view, but trying to use these rescuers not to say that all Germans were this or that, but rather to show that not all of them were as bad. Yes. Maybe, I mean, I could stop here. I could show you some more examples, but maybe I could stop here and then we could talk about some of the other issues in the book, and I could hear.
That's absolutely fine. We can stop here. I was waiting for the next slide, but we can definitely stop here, and I will move on to introduce Harry, and then we'll let you two have a go at it. So let me just give a quick introduction to Harry Legg. He is a fourth-year PhD student, congratulations, at the University of Edinburgh, and researches Germans of Jewish descent who did not identify as Jewish between 1933 and 1945, a completely interesting topic, on its own. Legg's research is funded by the AHRC and the Claims Conference. Currently a visiting fellow at the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford, he had research fellowships from the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich and the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, or ERI, respectively. Legg's research articles have appeared in the Journal of Holocaust Research, Journal of Genocide Research, and Contemporary European History. Pieces are forthcoming in Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the Journal of Contemporary History. And with that, Harry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maydeen. I appreciate the introduction. It's very kind. Thank you, Kobi, for inviting me. I think it's unusual for a PhD student to have a chance to talk to this large an audience. So I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, as I told Kobi, I'm going to start with a quote from the sadly late and I think great Alon Confino. Alon was, I didn't know Alon personally, but he was Kobi's PhD supervisor at the University of Virginia. And in 1997, he wrote the following lines, which I think Kobi has more than lived up to and perhaps even exceeded. So Confino wrote this: "When historians attempt to interpret evidence of memory from a representation of the past, the risk of a circular argumentation is high. The overall consequence is an arbitrary interpretation." I'm skipping little bits there, but and then Confino continues and says that if we fail to heed this warning, we have no way to evaluate, control, and verify the importance of the evidence without a systematic study of reception. And here's the important part, he says, and we end up constructing the history of memory from visible signs whose significance is taken for granted. Now, Kobi has heeded this warning and has done the exact opposite. His book is all about doing the exact opposite. It wouldn't exist without that. He's challenging current interpretations, which are all about the visible signs, and what is comfortable perhaps for us in the present. Kobi's book is all about the opposite. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of that as briefly as I can, and then I'm going to move on to a more sort of historical focus. I'm not a historian of memory, but I am, I suppose, a historian of 1933 to 45, but nonetheless, I'm reasonably familiar with some of the literature on Holocaust memory, and these two things stood out. These are two ways I think that Kobi does not construct the history of memory from visible signs, whose significance he took for granted in his book. He didn't take these signs for granted. So, I'm not sure if Kobi mentioned it, but it's typically said that in post-war Germany there was this sort of totalitarian narrative that said Hitler and a cabal of cronies had taken power and committed criminal acts without the involvement of the population at large. And that this was a sort of, this was promoted by political leaders, and the purpose was to, allow the end of denazification and the conflation of Nazism with communism, right, under the totalitarian banner. And it could easily be assumed that this was reproduced on the grassroots level, right? This sort of political narrative, this Western narrative. But Kobi doesn't assume this is the case, and he really looks into it, and I recommend reading the book. But just, he looks at, for example, filmmakers, TV producers, writers, and while he sees that they do distinguish between Germans and Nazis, almost so as to ingratiate themselves with the viewers, they do so not in order to exculpate them completely, but rather they do so in order to, and here I quote Kobi, he says, they incorporate elements that indicted the population for not doing more for the persecuted and against the Nazi regime. And this, of course, is completely against the sort of political narrative and also the narrative that historians often ascribe to that period. Of course, things are changing in that regard, and Kobi is part of the change, but that's one way that he really doesn't construct the history of memory from the visible signs. And I think another way he does that is, this is more obvious, but when talking about East and West Germany in the book, he certainly distinguishes between the two when needed, and there's no suggestion whatsoever that he conflates them or smudges them together. But I think this might be the part where I'm being sort of ignorant, not as a historian of memory, but for me, this is the first book I've read on memory where I really am reminded constantly that East and West Germans actually lived in the same state during the Nazi period. It might sound like a stupid or obvious thing to say, but you really get the sense that they experienced the same thing. And again, this is about not reading the political signs, because obviously the differences between the East and West German governments are enormous in terms of their memory of the Holocaust. Maybe the result is actually not that enormous of a difference, but the narratives are different. They're both doing the same thing from the other side of the coin. The East Germans are saying they're all fascists in the West now, and that's the same as the fascists back during the Nazi period. And then vice versa, the West is saying they're all totalitarians now, just like during the Nazi era, and both sides are exculpating themselves. But on the ground, that's just not always what's happening. It's obviously sometimes what's happening. But Kobi really shows that he really shows, I think, similarities between the two populations. And Kobi, I think this is correct, Kobi, but none of the chapters are about either West or East Germany. There are certainly sections within which are, but he really deals with them together, and I think it's excellent. And I wanted to make a brief point in relation to that, which is that I think many people, this may be sort of, if there are any historians in the audience, will know this perhaps better than members of the public, but I suppose in public memory, the words and thoughts and memories of survivors are really valued, but historians actually don't always have that same opinion. And we see there was a USHMM collection which came out some time ago, which didn't include post facto sources at all. Many of you probably like the works of Saul Friedlander, or his famous double volume Nazi Germany and the Jews. That doesn't include post facto sources for the most part. And I think when you read Kobi's work, you really are reminded that, and that fits in with the 2 points I've just made, you really are reminded that people do not just follow the collective memory of their society. They stray away from it constantly. And I think there are historians like Christopher Browning who recognize that all too well. He has a book from 2010 called Remembering Survival, and he uses post facto sources to great effect in that. And the reason is precisely because, like Kobi and like Alon Confino, he doesn't he doesn't construct the history of memory or just the history of anything from the visible signs we'd assume. So Christopher Browning, he doesn't say, okay, well, so Browning was focusing on one particular camp, the history of that camp, and he didn't say, well, I'm assuming that the survivors who emigrated to Israel created a sort of collective memory within their group, which was completely different from that of the survivors who went to America. Rather, he found that actually the individual memories, and they might still be distorted, so you still have to read them critically, obviously, but he found that the individual memories actually still came through very, very strongly, and he was able to write a book using that. And I think in a sort of indirect way, Kobi's book, when you read it, it reminds you, you really do have to look beyond merely collective memory. And this is sort of my way of saying I wish historians would use post facto sources more. They're different, they have different problems, but they're not necessarily worse. And I get that very strongly from Kobi's book. That might be a bit of a tangential way of relating to Kobi's book, but that's one thing I felt. I now want to, I still have some time. I now want to basically, this is where it gets controversial, I'm afraid. And I think maybe some people will not like what I have to say, but I'm going to present to you, I think, two so-called facts, I think they're facts, which I think support Kobi's critique of what he calls an idealization. The idealization that because only a very few Germans helped Jews, and by Jews, as Madeleine and Kobi have both hinted at, I mean people who were defined as Jews by Nazi racial law. Just because there are very few helpers does not mean that we can infer something about the populations as a whole, the population's views. And I think there are good factual reasons which sort of go alongside Kobi's delineation of the memory progression after the war. That in itself tells you that this idealization is probably suspicious and suspect and shouldn't be listened to. But I think also the actual facts back up Kobi's critique. So the first thing, so it's said that there's hardly any rescuers, right? And in the territories of Austria, Germany, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and also the other included territories, which were sort of stolen before 1939, it's said that only about 80,000 non-Jews helped in substantive efforts to hide Jews underground in the period following October 1941. And that's when deportations begin, for the most part. There are some before that, but for the most part, that's the sort of the period when Jews start hiding underground. So only 80,000 helped. And guess how many that's out of? That's 80,000 out of 80 million. And some people say it's as few as 50,000. But the point is, whichever way you look at it, that's 99.9% or more of the population did not provide substantive help to Jews going underground who were fearing for their life. This would seem to be a pretty damning fact, right? Well, no. It's actually not. And it's not just not a damning fact for the reasons Kobi says, although I agree with them. It's also not a damning fact because, listen to this, there were 300 Jews left in the territories I just mentioned by that point. And according to one study from Berlin, perhaps about 10% of them actually even attempted going underground. So that might mean that if we extrapolate that to the 300,000, and that might be a risky extrapolation, but that I couldn't find other figures. But if we extrapolate that, it might be the case that only some 30,000 Jews in Germany, Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, and all the other little bits of territory, only 30,000 even attempted going underground. And when you actually compare that to the 80,000 non-Jews who helped, or 50,000, however you define it, it starts to look a lot less bad. Now, we shouldn't go the other way and sort of talk about another idealization of the German population, but I think it rather points out that when we compare to the 80 million, it's really not a relevant comparison. It bears it's really a completely uninteresting point to make that 99.9% didn't help, because we're only dealing with a very small population, right? And so only very few had the opportunity to help. And when you add into that the fact that in 1941, it was forbidden to express public sympathy for Jews, for example, you begin to understand that the idealization that Kobi finds through a study of memory, and also, to be fair, through a study of the history in the first chapter, you begin to realize that it's not only contrived in a sort of commemorative sense, it's just wrong. It's flat out wrong historically, I'm afraid. That's a clear argument. I'm now going to move on to, do I still have time? I can cut the second part, but as briefly as I can, there's another part to this which is probably more controversial. The previous part was just sort of statistical. This part is that, and here I risk creating another idealization. I want to be clear that what I'm saying in what follows is that the current idealization is wrong. I'm not necessarily saying the opposite is true, but I also don't think that the evidence that most Germans, and I use that term knowing that Kobi is frowning at me right now, but I don't think that most Germans actually supported Nazi anti-Semitic policy. And this, again, might be surprising to people who are not acquainted with the historiography, the secondary literature. Is firstly, no historian, pretty much no historian, apart from perhaps Daniel Jonah Goldhagen or maybe Otto Dov Kolker, who was, by the way, Kolker is nothing like Goldhagen. Kolker was an excellent historian. Goldhagen wasn't even a historian, but no one would claim, for example, that the vast majority of Germans supported the Holocaust itself, the actual killing, the murder of Jews. That's not actually a claim anyone makes in the historical literature. Certainly, it's true that many members of the Wehrmacht participated, and certainly it's true that some segments of the population were more sort of anti-Semitic than others. And in fact, supporting the policy has nothing to do with anti-Semitism in the sense that most of those who opposed Nazi anti-Semitic policy were also anti-Semitic. But so what I'm trying to say is no one even contests. So there's this idealization we have that the Germans supported the Holocaust, but actually you'll struggle to find a historian who believes that the population supported the murder itself. But beyond that, historians often divide Nazi anti-Semitic policies into two categories: the civilized, quote unquote, I don't believe any of the policies were civilized, and the uncivilized, or the violent and the non-violent, or the legislative and the non-legislative. And it's often said that Germans reacted sort of almost in a selfish way to the violent anti-Semitic policies like the Kristallnacht pogrom, top-down driven pogrom, but they don't really care, or they even support, and they quite welcome the Nuremberg laws, for example, a sort of civilized, the Germans, the civilized people, they can be happy to welcome these laws. But in fact, unfortunately, or fortunately, it doesn't matter to me which is fortunate or not. The fact is, even research shows that it's not just the Kristallnacht pogrom, or the violence of the April 1933 boycott, or the grassroots violence that preceded the Nuremberg laws. It's not just that was rejected by large swathes of the population. I can't put a percentage on it, but it wasn't just those policies. It was also the Nuremberg laws. Peter Lonrich he's a genuine leading historian on this, a German historian no less. He's just published a book called Unwillige Volksgenossen, Unwilling People's Comrades, clues in the title, and he concludes on the basis of an extensive analysis of the Social Democratic Party reports and the secret governmental reports that the Nuremberg laws were rejected by the population. And this is the centerpiece of the thesis that says that the Germans supported the civilized policies. And there's also no question that, for example, the 1941 Star Decree, where Jews were forced to wear stars in public, there's no question that that was supported. That was not supported by the population. David Bankier, who is a keen proponent of the notion that the population supported civilized measures, he said, he basically acknowledged it as a problem. And I have the quote here. He said, this is a guy who really, he was a protege of Otto Dov-Kolter, and Bankier said regarding the Star Decree, quote, such a display of sympathy for Jews and manifest disapproval of Nazi policy is a conspicuous exception to German conduct in general. And that's someone who believes that he is unfortunately dead, but who believed that the population supported even the civilized policies. Now, we don't know. Here, I'm just contesting the idealization. I'm not going the other way and saying 99% were against the policy. And I'm also not denying complicity, even if support was not involved. For example, while most historians agree that anti-Semitism didn't play a role in making people vote for the Nazis, for the most part, it's also true that very few people chose not to vote for the Nazis because the anti-Semitism was too much. It's not like they found it the most appealing thing, but they didn't really mind that it was in there. So what I'm saying, please don't understand it as denying that anti-Semitism was rife in society. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that Kobi's idealization, or rather the idealization that Kobi describes, I'm saying that really has no basis in fact. It might be 40%, 60% one way or another, but yeah. The point is that the idea of 95% in favor is just nonsense. And I think it's too often described as not nonsense in the public sphere. So that's basically my presentation. I hope it wasn't too long.
No. It was just fine. So before we go on to the conversation between Kobi and Harry, there is one short comment here that I thought I would just mention before you start. Someone wrote that in Germany there was no organized underground anti-Nazi movement that actually aided Jews. Besides, there was the White Rose, but it was a small group. So I'm just, throwing that in there with what you were just talking about, Harry. And also, it's very interesting afterwards, if we remember, to maybe go back to the euthanasia program and the doctors and how they used the Nuremberg laws to sort of give okay to the work that they were doing, not only with Jews. So I'm just going to put that in there as well. And of course, we'll wait for more questions. There are a few things in the chat, but at this point, I'm going to let Harry and Kobi go at it with their conversation.
Thank you, Maiden. Thanks, Harry. Maybe I'll just respond a little bit to some of the things that Harry said. So you can see maybe already the pattern of why I wanted Harry to come and talk, because we agree on some of the critical point. But in terms of, so our criticism of the simplistic way within which the assessments or the very simplistic assessments of the entire population or the behavior of entire populations as if it is something that can be measured and can be created specifically in time. But I would, so what really bothers me more is the very structure, is not the fact that life is complicated, because this is something that we all know, right? So I know much, rather than just say that everything is much more chaotic and messy and gray than we assume. The point is that there is the insistence, in spite of what I'm trying to show, the mess I'm trying to show in the first chapter, there is the insistence all around in the post-war years, but especially in the historiography, to speak about this reality as if it is very simple and as if it is something that can be divided into good or bad, or that is in moral terms. And what we are trying to show is that it's much more chaotic and messy, and that everything that we are doing, which is not in this way, is in a sense not only idealization because it tries to create a certain reality, but also it's an attempt to create a certain reality, to project a certain image while ignoring all of these facts that don't fit into the picture, right? That is basically the idea.
And yeah, I mean, one point I wanted to add, I've got some questions for you, Kobi, in a second. One point I wanted to add is that we also have to distinguish between policies that that the population supported and policies that they didn't. It's not only wrong to say that the population is a monolithic thing which can go one way or another. It's also wrong to talk only about one policy. My presentation was extremely biased, but that was because of the time. But you know, if we were to talk about support for the war, again, who has precise figures? But find me a German that wanted, or find me a German that wasn't happy. Okay, now I sound like the idealization, but I'm making an exaggerated point. And which German didn't support the war, or you know, all these kind of things, or who wasn't happy when the Treaty of Versailles was overturned, or you know, from policy to policy, things are completely different. And also, there's the fact, like, how can you measure in a dictatorship? Popular opinion is another whole thing. But I wanted to ask Kobi one thing about his first chapter. Again, it's on the same topic, but it's a thing I've been thinking about for a while, but you've crystallized it perfectly, I think. You sort of talk, in the historiography, there's a divide between coercion and consent, which is perhaps in itself part of the problem. I mean, I actually subscribe to the divide, but I think the divide needs to be defined better. But you talk of how people acted in accordance with Nazi anti-Semitic principles, and they often did it in a sort of spontaneous way, but in fact, there was an implicit threat. And I liked when you talked about the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, how this ideal was disseminated and people sort of knew they had to act in that way. And it's like there was no terror in the background. So we're not sort of saying we're going back to the era of the all-seeing Gestapo, but there was nonetheless a pressure and yet also freedom to act. But it wasn't really freedom. I mean, just that's a bad characterization of you put it very beautifully in the book, actually, but maybe I should have brought a quote, but feel free to comment on that, on the third way and how you think it might help.
Yeah. So the point was really to show. So in the first chapter was first really to show how. I think I start the chapter by saying it was not illegal as such. There was no law that forbade helping Jews in Nazi Germany. And I remember when I first realized that, I was like, the hell, you know, because we assumed this immediately. But the fact that the law does not exist really shows you that the Nazis were much more interested in having excited agreement, right? Conform to some kind of conformity to an idea and to a movement, much more than being afraid of the terror part, of the coercion part of the society, which was of course central as well. So there is quite a lot of much more interested in really in the performative elements of that, right? Whereas of course for the Nazis it's quite important how you feel, whether you really internalize these kind of notions. What is more important for them is how it looks like in public, because they need this appearance, the appearance of a unified Volksgemeinschaft, of a unified national community, in a sense, like, right, we see in different periods and like today. So there is an attempt to create, and therefore there is also a certain kind of a notion of social shaming or social pressure in different forms. So whereas on the one hand you could say, well, the state doesn't use law, but on the other hand you could say, okay, it doesn't. By using morality, it makes it an even stronger impact on society, or a different way of impacting society. Yeah. So
yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, okay.
I'm sorry, but no, I mean, I agree entirely. And here, I think the difference between the normative and prerogative state, as per Ernst Frankel's characterization, is helpful, because also there's not just the law; there is also other means of gaining compliance, right? But Yes, I think I really want to emphasize that I recommend people read this book. I wasn't paid to say this. It's a really excellent book, especially read the 1933 to 45 chapter, and it will pique your interest. And I think I wanted to ask you also about the flow between. This is one thing if I'd had more time, I would have said. You really link the history to the memory in a way that is not typically done. It's not, most books on memory will have a chapter with the history at the front. I can think of numerous books about post-war memory that start with a chapter, but it's usually so squalid, so boring. But this chapter, it actually flows directly into the post-war chapters. Maybe you can talk more about the just the narrative, the sort of the discourse which is created and how it's inverted, or yeah, just some of the strange stories about, you're trying to avoid them finding out about your Jewish grandmother, and then the next day you're doing the opposite. But there's also things about the Jewish slave term and all those. So please feel free to, or please could you just say
Yeah.
something about that? It's
I
great.
mean, so there's a lot of thanks. The first chapter is actually the last one I wrote, or I wrote it. Let's say it this way: the book had all kinds of forms, and it was all kinds of articles. And before that, it was in a very different way. It was a dissertation, and the first chapter of the dissertation was just it was the first one that I wrote, and it was just a mess. It was not a mess in the celebratory way that I had before. It was just a mess. So I realized that I need to go deeper, and in the 7 years or something before finishing, before sitting to write the book, I've emphasized quite a lot more on the first chapter, and then I could see already in that time, because I both wrote it first originally and then I wrote it last, so I could see continuities or similarities or references, both forward looking and backward looking, in a sense. So this is the advantage of forgetting a book and then getting back to it, and the idea was really to show how some of my favorite, like Jeffrey Orlick and some really wonderful scholars of memory studies, some of them speak about this notion about how we tend to assume that memory begins when the event ends, but this is of course very wrong. Memory begins before the event begins, usually, with all kinds of things that lead to the event.
Mm-hmm.
And then while the event itself is taking place, a lot of images and pictures and evaluations and moralities are being included, and this very often flows then into the post-war. So the immediate post-war years and later on are fascinating, because they are not only the beginning, the explosion of a lot of things, but also, they are opening the gate for a whole bunch of things that happened before, and also because the post-war years are constantly responding to the Nazi years, to the Nazis, and to the language of the Nazis, and to the images of the Nazis, and so on and so forth. With almost every single aspect of what they do in science, in the state, in education, in the definition, of anything, in the flag, of course. All of these things are all references against the Nazi state, and the constitutions, obviously. And so we see constant dialogue there. The dialogue is there, right? People, it's the same people, it's the same people, obviously, and they refer to these kind of, so you can really see this continuation. And also eventually a lot of these stories are stories of, just like you said, right, these are stories of individuals. So you need to just see individuals in certain moments in time. And this is, in terms of the way that I write this, I just told this story to someone. Some years ago, I heard a fascinating talk by an Israeli author, Meir Shalev. He passed away since. And someone asked him about how could it be that in his novels he's able to combine so many different stories of different people and different characters in different times in such a wonderful way. Really a wonderful writer. Roman Russi, for example, or Keyamim Achadim is probably my favorite. And so Meir Shalev answered, and he said, well, the way I do it is I write a lot of short comments on little pieces on paper, and then at a certain point I feel like I have enough, and I spread them all on the floor, and I just start combining them. And so when I was working on especially on the first chapter, I was thinking very much in terms of, okay, to just take people, put them in, moments in different time, and to put them even physically in front of each other and to see how they can relate to each other and what stories do they tell. So that was kind of a continuation.
Okay, yeah, it's a good answer, a very good answer. Thank you. Yeah, we've talked a lot about the history, and well, I have, and you have responded. But I want to a sort of a very targeted question here, which is a little bit more historiographical. I think maybe very few people in this call will have believed in the so-called myth of silence, in comparison perhaps to historians who seem to think there was a lot of silence. But so I don't know, ever since David Cesarani's book, and he had a co-editor whose name I forgot, I apologize, but there have been books debunking the idea that after World War II, nobody spoke about the Holocaust, especially the idea that people defined as Jewish didn't speak about it. And in fact, it turns out that they did. This has been debunked. But why do you think that has been debunked and it's now standard fare in the historiographical field, but the idea that rescuers haven't been talked about is still a big deal? Oh, it's still a belief that many, you said it was German historians who had this view. Maybe you want to speak more about this in general, maybe establish the facts, because I'm just remembering from the book here. But why do you think one myth of silence was destroyed 10, 15 years ago, maybe, and the other is something that you had to write a book about?
Yeah, so the silence thing is in Germany, very often this is a generational thing, although it goes beyond. So a lot of the historians who were really starting to write about rescue, and especially in the 90s and 2000s, were born in the 1940s. So they are this kind of a skeptical generation, as they are called in West Germany, and mostly from West Germany. Some from East, and they had, I don't want to do a psychologization of them now, but you could see that there is quite a lot of, there's a lot of importance for many of them to emphasize a process of learning, and a process of learning defines or requires showing that everything, or it helps if you show that everything was much worse before. So if we were really, really bad in the Nazi period and we're not good enough in the post-war years, now we are getting better. This is a very simplistic, I'm sorry, this is, recorded, but this is more or less what you can argue. This is a good argument to define yourself. And these people are, I don't want to criticize them personally, because some of them, many of the researchers, studies that I use are by them or by the students, and they've been doing amazing works in these fields. But I think they tend to, or many of them, those that I've met in Germany, tend to adopt very, very strict, simple depictions of. I remember years ago, 2011 or something, I was a PhD student working on this project, and I looked at all of these sources, and I knew about the existence of so many references. And then there was this conference, and this one of these 1940s born person, a very famous German historian in his field, told me, he spoke about how there was complete repression and forgetting and ignoring of all the rescuers in Germany after the war. And I came with my sweet kind of, hi, I'm Kobi. I'm working on all of these topics now, and I have a whole bunch of references to that, whereas you say there was nothing. And his response to me was quite telling, because his response was just repeating what he had said before. He said, no, the German society was not interested in looking at it at all. And that was the end of the non-discussion. So I think there is a certain kind of an insistence, which is a political insistence. It's a moral insistence, because this narrative is this whole discussion is extremely moral, and it's all about, or much of it is all about, depicting oneself in a favorable way, even if that favorable way is depicting all of your forefathers in a negative way, for example. But again, this is a simple explanation of why partially this is happening. And it's connected, of course, to as I show in the later chapters, it connected very much to questions of politics and social change. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, do you feel, I feel like quite often in commemorative circles, I hear that we're sort of telling the difficult history, we're telling the difficult story with memory, as in inside the idealization you described that is currently dominant. It's often talked about, this is the hard, we really need to inform everyone about this. But I feel like it's forgotten that actually it's difficult for the people who did it back then, if they were still alive, to hear it. I feel like in some ways it's actually more comfortable to say that in a dictatorship there is a lot of agency and people are actually complicit for sitting by and doing nothing. I feel like that's actually that's more comfortable than saying actually, while it was not a totalitarian regime in the sense that there was there was room for maneuver, it is nonetheless, it's important to stop the Nazis before they take power, rather than rely on the human will inside. I feel like the latter is actually a more uncomfortable story. But we often talk about the discussion of complicity as though that's actually very uncomfortable for people today. Like it was when it first started coming out, right? Like, especially in the first decades after the war, when the people are actually involved, then of course it is very difficult to talk about that because they're still in government. I mean, I always think of Hans Globke, this criminal who I really dislike this guy, but he wrote, he contributed to writing the Nuremberg laws and found a job in the post-war it was the West German government, no? Yeah, I think that's anyway. I mean, would you like to comment on, I suppose, whether the idealization that you have critiqued in your book, do you think actually? I mean, I think you've hinted at this before, but do you think it's just very comfortable for people, and that's why we have it? Do you think there is actually I don't know. Could you comment on that? Do you think it's a comfortable idealization, or have I been too harsh in criticizing him?
I mean, well, in general, I don't want to just because I'm trying to avoid being. I'm trying to criticize the over-judgmental statement, not because people should not take responsibility for their actions, but because it's easy for us to just describe them in whatever way we want, for whatever reasons, and very often for very, not necessarily the best goals. So idealizations are not something that we can get rid of. This is the way we work. We need to make things simpler and to strip them off of some of the aspects and to focus on those aspects that we define as central while ignoring some others. This is how individuals are able to think and work. So that is fine. What I'm trying to do, and this is why I ended with a quote, right, with that quote that I like, is because that quote is really, for me, by Anthony Kwame Appiah, who speaks about this notion of idealization as something that are just attempts or perspectives on understanding the world. And these are, all we have is idealizations, but we need to accept the fact that they are idealizations. The best theories that we have about the world are that, and we need to assume we need to make it possible for more idealizations to emerge. So what I'm trying to say, even though I think I'm right in my criticism, I'm also just in a way trying to say that there isn't just one way of looking at this, and that everything is much more complicated, much more messy.
Yeah,
that would be my main.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think we do have to strive towards some sort of conclusion in what we say, but I think, and in that sense, we're anti-postmodernist, but in the other sense that you just described, we're acknowledging that actually it's very difficult to arrive at anything with certainty, and the more voices on a topic, the closer we are to some level of truth.
And the more sources, you could see that whatever source I could just find, I just immediately grabbed. I mean, all possible sources, not just to focus on one media or medium or one source or one whatever that is, but to check as many things that could disagree with the simple image, right? The idea is to really bring things that would get in my way. Not a very smart thing to do when you're a PhD student, but later on, it's actually quite a useful thing, at least to do, is to get more things that would disagree with your own ways of seeing reality. I think it's a very useful exercise.
Yeah, that's why I began with the quote from Alon Confino, because that's exactly what that quote is about. It's about not taking anything for granted and just running straight into the source and adapting your argument to the source rather than pretending the source doesn't exist. I have. It's a time for me to ask one more question. I do have
Maybe
one.
we could include some of that. I see there are a lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
There
Let's
are,
do
there
that.
are, yeah.
Go for that.
So if you want to go to a question, actually, it was something that I was going to ask as well, and I see that it was asking about the letters. You talk about the letters that were written. So what she says is, Joanna, that we both know, can we return for a moment to the main topic of the discussion, the rescue? Somehow we departed from it. So Kobi, the question is for you. You gave an example of an early letter written by a German rescuer accompanied by a confirming. Note by a Jews who the German rescuer have rescued. And I think it's a very interesting part of the book is actually not just talking about the German rescuers, but talking about the interaction post-war. So
yeah,
a little about that.
Joanna, are you still here?
She's here.
Okay.
I don't know where she is, but she's here.
She's over here.
She's here somewhere.
So yeah, thanks. I discussed quite at length in the second chapter this notion of the different kind of letters, and there's more and more to say about that as well. So the responses, the actions between, right, so there are some interactions we do not know. There are a lot of stories. There are even some things that became parts of movies. But we know that there were some cases in which people were forced let's say pushed towards giving, so Jews were pushed towards giving positive evaluations of people as if they were survivors, as if they were rescuers, as if they had helped them. And there were some cases that it was even associated with violence and threats. So there are these cases, and there are other cases in which we are definitely talking about certain kind of transactions or exchanges. And in other cases, it was definitely a very kind of emotional commitment of gratitude and assistance. So there are very different forms. In some cases, we have those who just helped once after the war, when it was in the case of denazification procedures and trials. And in other cases, we see, for example, Oskar Schindler's rescue survivors who have continued to maintain him financially and more than that until his death in 1974. Yeah. Examples for this in Germany, there are different examples. So some of them I mentioned now, they are in the second chapter. I looked at 4 different archives in the 4 different occupation zones to see if this is really something that happens everywhere. And I cannot say that everybody's doing that, because there's nothing that everybody's doing, but it definitely is happening everywhere. Everybody understands that it is useful. And very quickly, of course, this whole notion of selling, because once you also give this Persilschein, if you give this kind of attestation to show that someone is fine, and then you have become denazified, so to speak, and then you can already give these kind of attestations. So this is really a terrible idea of how to check someone's credentials, but this is how it, how it worked.
So I don't see another specific question for you, but I want to ask a question. I want to kind of put together, the concept of rescue and how it changed over the chapters, how it changed over time. And you already started hinting about, it's also a generational thing, but sort of kind of try to understand, the difference between like looking at the immediate rescue still during the Nazi period, and then looking at rescue as it becomes more of a memorialization of rescue, and who's doing the memorialization. What type of rescue is it? Is it a physical, moral rescue? So just, sort of along with that, you also have the survivors themselves that are documenting what happened to them. And of course, among their documentation is also the rescuer who is there as well. So kind of like maybe sum up from your experience, how rescue or the concept of rescue may have changed in the eyes, in the perspective of the German community, maybe also in the perspective of the Jewish perspective. For example, is it getting harder for the third generation to look at Germany as, maybe having rescuers or the opposite? So it's an open question. You can go in any direction you want.
Okay, you threw a lot at me. Okay.
Oh no. Pick a little part of it and
Yeah, so I so a part of, as you could understand, my book is trying to avoid any kind of a simple sentence, long conclusion. So, and this is why I'm looking at different sources and different people, and I'm looking also at Jews and non-Jews, and I showed that also among Jews, there are of course different kinds of Jews. German Jews, many of them are not originally from Germany after the war, and so which means that usually the first language is not German, or they don't necessarily speak German even, and they also have different kinds of opinions, and some of them are religious, some of them are not religious, some of them are Christians, some of them are Jews. So they have different kinds of opinions, and they are in different places, and they have different issues, and they are different people, of course. So the idea is really to show very different kinds of ways of thinking about or conceiving of the German collective, which all of them somehow do, while at the same time, and all of them somehow do in relation to the question of how many rescuers were they and what do they say about the collective. But all of them do that in very different ways. And in terms of the structure of the book, so as I said, 5 chapters. The first one is about Nazi Germany, and all the rest bringing us all the way to the present. They show how there is a certain kind of consolidation after a while, or partial consolidation, but they also of certain narrative, of the creation of certain concepts that repeat, or certain initiatives, certain kind of honorary initiatives, for example, giving awards, or creating different ways of adding these stories into memorials or whatever, or novels, or autobiographies, or history books, or films. But the point is really to show how all of these things together don't really have any kind of one, either from above or from below. They don't have one organizing element. The only things that relate to that, they emerge in relation to each other, just by the very existence of short references that after a while. So in the second chapter, I speak about scattered memories in a sense, right? And then the third chapter, I speak about those moments in which they are collected into certain events, like the Eichmann trial, which becomes a central element of talking about rescuers, or good Germans and bad Germans. And also about all kinds of anthologies, the first books that are collecting these images or the stories, and giving them very often one concept to name them. So the first time there is a phenomenon to this, a name to this phenomenon, even though the Holocaust is not yet a name there, because this happens already in the late 50s. So there are certain kind of consolidations of these things until, and that's what I'm trying to show in the later chapters, is that it becomes more and more not only familiar to speak about rescuers, but also expected, especially when there is any kind of a challenge, like Eichmann trial, like what you challenge in terms of morality, right? Eichmann trial in the beginning of the 60s, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial in the mid 60s, and the Holocaust, American Holocaust miniseries in 78, shown in 79, and so on, things in the 80s, and then in the 90s, and then the 2000s. So this becomes, so rather than speaking about everything started with the Schindler's List, as very often is the case, I'm trying to show that actually when Schindler's List arrived, everybody was expecting, right? In a way, rescue was all over, was everywhere. It's not a case of, as a lot of people, maybe of our generation or whatever generations, we want to speak about, oh, and then there was this great transformation or change. But rather, no, there is a certain kind of continuity that just at a certain point finds an American movie, right, that gives it more attention. Yeah, that's in terms of that. But what other questions? Sorry, you had.
No. I think that the answer that you gave actually gives us a description of how you have to read the book. And I think that that's really what, we're talking about, because it's a very difficult subject to talk about. I think among the German community, it was also a difficult subject to talk about publicly and individually. And I think that I think the second part of my question was more like the Jewish reaction to statements that were made publicly, but our time is really running out. So I'm just going to say, read the book, because these questions are brought up. There are a lot of things that we didn't talk about. I mentioned one thing is, the complicity of a nation. The Nuremberg laws, as far as I'm concerned, if you're saying there was no law saying that you have to abide with them, apparently they didn't need the law, right? Where do you have a law when someone goes against it, right? And here, apparently, it may not have been necessary because people complied. And I think that the doctors and the TOP that made the crematorium, I mean, they complied. So among that, you still looked for the rescuers. So Harry, do you want to say anything before we close?
Well,
or Kobi, if you want to say anything before we close?
Just a super brief point. I was replying to text, so maybe Kobi already. I was replying to text in the chat, I should say, not my own personal text.
No, the good. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Yeah, trying to master the system. But I just wanted to say, in relation to the lack of laws thing, I think if there's any, I understand Kobi's point regarding this. I think, but if there's perhaps anything I disagreed with, it was probably that point. He's not technically wrong, but I think there were so many effectively legal things, and there were. I mean, Kobi mentions these, so it's not like it's a matter of conceptualization, right? But in 1935, Rudolf Hess bans Nazi Party members from interacting with people defined as Jewish. So, and I think there are so many similar things which prohibit rescue, in fact. And if you read I really recommend everyone reads the Social Democratic Party reports, actually. You see just how intense the pressure was to stop interacting with Jews. I mean, we're talking sort of people, if you buy in a Jewish business, you lose your job. And these are like everyday guilds for we have the boss of that guild saying to his workers, you must not do this. I mean, the pressure is immense, really, really immense. And I think what's remarkable is how many people continue buying in Jewish shops late into the 1930s. And this is one reason I think Marion Kaplan's, she's an excellent historian, I know her, but her thesis of social death by 1935, I mean, the Nazis would have liked that to be so, but it really wasn't so. And that's one thing I think Kobi's book gets right as well. He shows how interactions between Jews and non-Jews continue long after 1935. His book, Kobi's book, wouldn't be possible without it. So yeah. Anyway, that's pretty much all I had. Oh no, I just wanted to mention also, this is a counter to the statistics I mentioned earlier. Some of the rescue attempts involve 40 or 50 people. So my point was not that there wouldn't have been any Jews who couldn't find anyone to help them. As in if it's 80,000 people, 80,000 rescuers and 30,000 Jews trying to get rescue. Well, some of the 30,000 are being helped by 50, and some of them are being helped by no one. So it's still not an exculpatory point, but I thought I should mention that as an important caveat that I didn't have time to mention, or I forgot. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay, Kobi, do you want to add anything before I close?
Just maybe one and a half things. Just what I saw it as a comment at the beginning from Gunnar Paulsen. Thanks so much for being here also. You're absolutely right that in many cases the initiators of rescue attempt were actually the Jews themselves, those who were persecuted rather than those. Right, it's not an act usually initiated by a non-Jewish person in many of these cases. So this is, again, just the situation of the rescue itself is not simply a moral event, right, in this sense. So even the most classic way we see and we speak about this, right? It's not in this case. It's at least very often we speak about this notion of at least knocking on the door. Someone is knocking on your door. You open the door and you have to make the decision, but the person knocking on your door is the one who initiated, of course, the act. So so I just wanted to say in general, thank you so much for your comments and for your questions and for coming. And thanks, Maiden, for organizing this, and Harry for your comments. This was really great.
It really was. So I want to say thank you to Kobi and Harry for this thoughtful and illuminating conversation you can see in the chat, and for helping us deepen our understanding of how rescue, responsibility, and memory continue to shape the ways societies confront their past. As we conclude, may this conversation remind us that memory is never static. It is shaped, challenged, and renewed by the questions we continue to ask. And with that, I want to say thank you to our audience as well for being with us. And for those of you that stayed with us until the end, you got to enjoy the essence of our meeting today, which was to have a conversation and a dialogue and even a little controversy, which I think is the best way to have a conversation. And Yoni, our tech person, I want to thank you as well. Without you, we could never do these programs, and I could never look as if I'm an expert on everything. So, and with that, I will say shalom to everyone. Thank you.